It's always a long off season for football. This is about the time of year where I really start to, you always miss it, but you really start to just kind of recognize, you feel it more. It cuts deeper that you're so far from the season, but you want it so bad. I made it till about April, the late April, maybe this week, even this first week of May, where I was like, man, I really miss college football. Not that I didn't miss it, the second that it was gone, but for you to really feel it, to feel the pain that it's really kicking up in May. We've got SEC spring meetings coming up, and we may get some big news out of that with their conference scheduling, just moving to 9 games. But until then, it's just speculation. So, but for now, after that, it seems like it moves pretty quick after the spring meetings, and then before we know it, we're at media days, and not long after that, we're in fall camp. Fall camp, it's only 3-4 weeks or so, but it feels like an eternity once we get to fall camp, and from the start of it to the first game. But anyways, this week on the college football podcast, we're gonna tier rank the SEC. Got some notable week 3 matchups. Gonna talk about Penn State and James Franklin, and we're gonna wrap up the show with teams that I'm high on, one team in each conference. So let's get started. Tier ranking the SEC. It's always important to start by kind of listing some criteria. Really, it's simple. It's some of it has to do with resources. Some of it has to do resources, staff, obviously performance in conference. On the field, it's valued the highest. Kind of bounced around with the criteria a little bit because it's kind of hard to get depending on how you want to tier rank them. But I'm just gonna go over the last 3 to 5 years with a take that the performance of the last 3 to 5 years with a kind of bigger picture futuristic approach to it. So it's tier one, obviously, kind of the usual suspects. We've got Georgia. They've two of the last 3 conference titles, 2 of the last 4 national championships. Obviously Georgia is probably the tippy top of tier one in the SEC. And that's really just because, Nick Saban's not at Alabama. Even with the kind of downturn Bama had near the end of his tenure, if he was still there, they'd probably be, neck and neck, 1A, 1B, probably, if not, Alabama just outright, taking the lead at the top of tier one. But we got Georgia, Alabama. Alabama, kind of speaks for itself. The new coaching staff, they're a high level staff. Still a lot of people in house that, are holdovers from Saban. A lot of, obviously one of, if not the most talented rosters in the sport, recruiting better, as good as they ever have. Their recruiting, there was no fall off when it came to how successfully they're recruiting there. A little drop, last season, but I I don't expect Bama to. I'd expect to see a big year 1 to year 2 jump under Kalen DeBoer. For lack of a better term, it's kind of a delicate situation. What he was walking into there. And he had some serious stones and a high, a big paycheck to go to Alabama, but it was a kind of a delicate situation, like I said. And year one, it's a tall task. Harder than it may seem, but I think that we're going to see a big jump. But obviously, they're still in tier one of the conference. Texas, it's hard to put them anywhere else other than tier one. Whenever they made the conference championship game their first year, even if they played a soft schedule, even though they got beat twice by Georgia, they did appear in the conference championship game. So it's hard not to have them up there, especially whenever we're talking about the linear progression that Sarkisian has had them on since he took over, starting in the Big 12, 5-7, 8-4, and then bang, they're winning the Big 12. They're in the playoffs in the 4 team, the last year of the 4 team, and then they come to the SEC year one, make the conference championship game. They're right back in the playoffs. So, it's hard to not have them up there. Are they going to continue that progression? I would say that they're on, when you have the level of alignment that, they seem to have there, and the support for the football program. They've got probably the best NIL in the country right now. Their recruiting is, they just signed the number 1 class, so we literally can't recruit any better. Their development, just had a bunch of guys drafted. They seem to have a really good development program going on there. So it seems that they're going to kind of be around for the foreseeable future, since he's brought them back to relevancy. So that's tier one, those three teams, so until farther notice, that's tier one. Moving on to tier two. So Tennessee, I've got you in tier two. These aren't in any specific order. I kind of had tier one ranked Georgia best in tier one, then Bama, then Texas, all tier one, but there's kind of a clear 1, 2, 3. And they can shuffle around as this year goes on. But tier two, there's not really any specific order in this tier. These are just the teams that I have identified that I think are tier two teams in the conference. So, like I said, Tennessee, since Heupel's taken over, you've consistently been, near the top. You've had a down year here and there, but they're a pretty high performing team. They've beaten Alabama a couple of times. They nearly made the playoff with Hendon Hooker, who, had he not gotten hurt, probably would have won the Heisman a couple of years back. It is, we could see a setback this year. Tennessee threatens to ascend every year, but this year with the whole situation there at quarterback, we could see a setback. It wouldn't surprise me. I'm not so sure that I would knock them if they did take a step back this year out of tier two, depending on how they recovered, in 2026. It may be a better, way of determining if they, elevate tiers or not, or the opposite. So, but they are in tier two, like I said, competitive consistently. So Texas A&M, I also have them in tier two. They have a lot of resources. They have, enough to be perennial. I know that that's kind of a point that people hammer home all the time. It's kind of, A&M fans are sick of hearing it. They want to see it. Everyone else is, sick of hearing it. They don't believe it because, A&M hasn't really done much notable on the field, but they do have as much resources, as anyone in the country. Top 5, in athletic department revenue and brand recognition and in value. They're extremely high level when it comes to, every sense of what you need for a successful perennial college football program. A&M is at the very top of, maybe not the very top as in number one, but they're top 5 of every category that, stadium check, fans check, money check, facilities check, NIL check. They have all of that. They just needed a better coaching staff than what Jimbo Fisher was offering. So top 5 talent roster sets them up every year. That's why they're kind of a perennial talking point rather than contender, because they have a lot of talent. They recruit, in the heart of Texas, the most talent-rich state in the country. Even though Mike Elko has actually, if you go and look at their recruiting class right now, there's more kids coming from out of the state than in the state right now. So it was the same with the first class he signed. So I'm curious to see how he kind of continues to tailor and change his strategy there. But but they do, I think, have a better coaching staff with Elko and the guys that he's assembled around him. So I expect, I think that this is a team that could get better this year and have the same record that they did last year. Their elevation doesn't really translate to the, wins and loss category, but which could be, disappointing, but we'll see. LSU, they're tier 2 as well. Every couple of years they seem to jump up and have a tier 1 type season, but they're never perennially in that picture. They don't make the playoff every year, even though everyone expects them to. They don't make the conference championship every year, even though everyone expects them to. They're kind of a team that the national media has given them more credit than what they deserve for what they really are. And that doesn't mean that they're bad by any stretch of the imagination, but they kind of treat them every year like, talk about them in the same sentence as a Texas or an Alabama or Georgia or whatever. But they never, not never, but they rarely actually wind up being, performing at that level. So, but they have performed consistently near the top under Brian Kelly. They've progressed their, in NIL a lot over this offseason. I think we may have a situation here where it's kind of hard. I'd like to see where the season goes, but we may be kind of nearing the peak of what they've been building there. Kind of like we are at like Penn State, for example. You have Garrett Nussmeier coming back. It's kind of, foggy as to who you're going to have replace him after you lost Bryce Underwood. So we may see them at the peak of their current window. And and I don't think it's necessarily a very high peak. So, but we'll see. Ole Miss, they're tier two for the foreseeable future. Um, and I don't say that in a bad way. Lane Kiffin has elevated that program. They used to be a tier three, maybe even some years a tier four type program, but he's elevated them into the second tier of the conference and has built a solid, foundation to keep them there and to elevate, have a chance every couple of years to jump into that tier one. They've turned out to be an NIL leader. They have consistent production. He's proven I remember when the whole portal thing kind of started a couple of years ago, and we had teams like Ole Miss that focused more on portal recruiting than they did high school recruiting. And the big question about that was, are we going to see kind of what happened to Florida State? Like, are we going to see that? Like, is there going to be a situation where great year this year, but you bring in more portal guys and then you completely fall off? Like, are we going to see that at Ole Miss? And that was kind of something that everyone speculated about, those teams that recruited mostly out of the portal. Obviously, that's a reality whenever you see what happened to Florida State. But so far at Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin has done a really, really good job at bringing in high-level talent through the portal, establishing a culture and assimilating that talent and translating that to production on the field and development, and has sent guys to the NFL through this process. And until farther notice, I think that as far as Ole Miss goes in this portal style recruiting, first of all, their high school recruiting has begun to elevate because of their consistent high-level performance on the field. But until we see them kind of fall off or have rocky years, years as in literally multiple years of this, I think that they're going to be, we can trust the process that they've built there in Oxford. So the last team I have in tier two, hear me out on this one. I've got Missouri, back-to-back 10-win seasons. They've really kind of shown themselves to be a leader in NIL, especially compared to, when you look at what kind of the expectation there was just a couple of years ago to what it is now. Drinkwitz, similar to Lane Kiffin, has really elevated that program in Columbia and has kind of increased expectations. They're still not necessarily looked at a national level, with a lens of any high level respect, but I think that they're building something good there. He's elevated that program in Missouri. It is, I think, a show me year. Losing a lot of talent in production, obviously, with your quarterbacks, your wide receiver core. So it's going to be a tall task to replace that and not miss a beat in the win-loss column. But you are bringing in some talent from the high school recruiting ranks. He's done a pretty good job at keeping the high-level in-state talent in-state, for the most part. So he's built a pretty solid foundation there to continue to, be considered, in my mind, tier two of the conference and potentially build to a season where they elevate into tier one. But as far as I'm concerned right now, they are a solid tier two team there at Columbia. Originally, I had started this segment as just notable out of conference games each week. I just kind of they just kind of stand out to me. I'm always a big fan. I love the high end out of conference matchups that we don't get to see very often. I don't think that I'm unique in that way. So I thought I'd kind of build a segment around it. I knew that at some point it was going to get a little thin as conference play ramped up, and I hit that mark earlier than I was expecting. So I'm kind of changing it to just notable matchups, with an emphasis on out of conference, but there are some conference matchups that are, notable throughout, each week that I'm going to kind of throw into this just, for some more content. So, but week 3, like I said, we've got conference games and out of conference, but so just notable matchups. The first one that jumps out to me the most is Texas A&M at Notre Dame. So Notre Dame and A&M, they played last year in College Station. So the rematch from last year, the home and home. Notre Dame, obviously, they won that game in week 1. This will be their 7th meeting all time. A lot of question marks around this game. So how has A&M improved? Has Marcel Reed taken that step forward? This is week 3 this year, not week 1 like last year. So is Le'Veon Moss back? Is he healthy? Is he kind of back to what he was at the peak of last season before he got injured? Has Marcel Reed progressed as a passer? How's that, those wide receiver transfers? Are they, panning out like everyone kind of expected them to? What is Notre Dame? Same thing there. How's their quarterback room looking with replacing Riley Leonard? They're bringing back some talent, but they also lost some guys to the draft. So obviously that national championship appearance they had last year, it's going to be hard to match that without actually winning the championship. So, but for this is the first kind of game for both teams. It's a big litmus test. Notre Dame, funny, they play Miami week 1, and then they have a bye week 2 before this game, week 3 with A&M. So Notre Dame's going to be coming off a bye after just playing once. A&M, they have, two lower tiered, with all due respect, games, not really playing anybody the first 2 weeks. So they'll have a couple weeks to kind of tune up, get some in-game reps. So I kind of favor A&M going into this matchup from that perspective, since they're going to have, they're going to be rolling in week 3 after, having, like I said, live reps. Notre Dame's going to be coming off a bye after one game, so it may be a little hard to get up and running, but I think that's going to be a good game. And I don't know who I would favor right now as far as, point spread wise, but when you look at it from that angle, I kind of favor A&M. So similarly, we've got Wisconsin at Alabama, another rematch from last year, the home and home series that Bama won. Tyler Van Dyke, he got hurt early last year in this game, but he's gone now. So this is actually only the 4th meeting all time. It's kind of a show me year for Luke Fickell. So that's kind of, the talking point from Wisconsin. He's been there for several years, and we kind of need to see it, some progress, some elevation out of Wisconsin and that coaching staff. Otherwise, we may be having an interesting conversation about that future. Is Bama legit? I feel good about Bama this year. How's that year 1 to year 2 jump under Kalen DeBoer? Has that happened? How's his quarterbacks? How's that room look after the departure of Jalen Milroe? I think that Bama could be pretty legit this year, but this will be a good, test for him as well. After that week 1 game at Florida State, this will be another test. So other games, we got Florida at LSU week 3. So this is the first conference game for both teams. What did LSU do week 1? That's kind of where my head's at in this. If they win week 1 against Clemson, talking point's going to be they're going to the playoff. LSU's a legit contender. They're going to the playoff. If they lose, it's going to be complete and total despair if they lose that week 1 game against Clemson. And it's going to be a real toxic situation there in the fan base if they lose that week 1 game coming into this. And so it's going to be a big show-me game either way. But I think that's going to be the talking points around LSU going into the game. For Florida, is DJ Lagway healthy? There's been some problems this offseason. Obviously, he hasn't thrown the ball much. He just recently started throwing. There's still some speculation that he may not be fully, 100% by the time the season rolls around. But I am, I have an optimistic outlook. So other than that, if not now for Billy Napier, when they chose to keep him on staff there, they chose to keep that staff in place. It sounds like a lot of that had to do with keeping DJ Lagway, but if they have a bad season this year and, it doesn't really matter who your quarterback is if you can't win more than 6 or 7 games, right? So even if he is, as talented as he is, if you can't, make the playoff, make the conference championship, get to where you want to go, then it doesn't really matter. So moving on, Pitt and West Virginia got the backyard brawl rivalry game, this out-of-conference matchup. Week 3, first big test for Rich Rod there, returning to West Virginia. So I'm interested in that game. And finally, we got Georgia at Tennessee. Same thing here. First conference game for both teams. Big test for both, obviously. My questions are kind of, has Georgia regressed? I think we saw some of that, some clear signs of regression last year, compared to the peak that they had in their 2 national championship years. So have they regressed? And what's Tennessee without Nico? Have they... Probably not, but have they kind of seamlessly transitioned in a new quarterback and who's taking control of the offense? And I'd say if you're as good as you were last year, then you're lucky. It's hard for me to say you're better right now, but I'd say if you can get to the level that you were last year, that would be a massive accomplishment there in Knoxville. So that's kind of my questions and, the storylines in my mind around those matchups for week 3. Make sure you follow the podcast. Follow me on X, Instagram, Campus Pigskin. Make sure you, like I said, follow the podcast so you get alerts whenever I post new episodes. Doing one every week. So college football year-round, every week. Finishing up with the tier ranking of the SEC, we covered tiers 1 and 2. So moving on to tier 3. Unfortunately, I've got Florida. Obviously, you're in tier 3. Struggled a lot under Napier. That's pretty obvious. You've had a lot of talent on the roster. You've sent guys to the league, but, like I said, a lot of talent on the roster. It's really not excusable whenever you consider roster talent, how kind of bad they've done. Not terrible, but just not great, not anywhere near, the level that's expected there. I think we could see an elevation to tier 2 this year. DJ Lagway comes back healthy, like I talked about. I think we got, they could have a really good season, but they do have a hard schedule. I don't think it's as tough as it was last year just because, they play the same teams, but I think a lot of those teams maybe are taking a step back, and even the games they lost, they were, like Georgia, they were real competitive in that until Lagway went down, obviously. But I think we could see an elevation into tier 2, but they've just performed, average to below average consistently under Napier thus far. So until farther notice, that's where you're sitting in tier 3. South Carolina is kind of a weird one, but especially coming off the season they just had, a lot of people think that they should have gone to the playoff. I happen to think that if you lose 25% of your games in the regular season, that you should not make the playoff. But the problem is that under Beamer there, they haven't been consistent. They'll have a good season and then they'll follow it up with a terrible season. So they've shown that, that staff, or I guess maybe not that staff because it's changed, but that head coach, he's shown that he can assemble a staff and put together a team to really threaten, in the SEC. But they just can't consistently year over year progress. They have, like I said, a good year and then a down year and then a good year and then, an average year and then, like I said. So until we get some more consistent, play out of them, I think tier 3 is a good spot. Oklahoma, it's kind of a on the fence one. You're kind of teetering, you're in tier 3, kind of teetering on a drop to tier 4, but you're also that, the other side of that fence is tier 2. So this is a big year, I think, for Brent Venables. It's kind of a show me year for him. I think that you're either probably going to drop into tier 4 or you're going to elevate to tier 2. I'd say 8-4 would probably be, top of tier 3, maybe bottom of tier 2. 9-3, I'd say, is a solid elevation to tier 2. Anything less than 8 wins, I'd say 6 wins or less. Let's say if you don't make a bowl game, I'd probably say that that's a drop to tier 4, but they're kind of teetering there, like I said. But tier 3, just, they've played a really tough schedule since they've joined the SEC, and that's going to continue this year. That they might have the hardest schedule in the country. But Auburn, you're also in tier 3. Obviously, everyone talks about that, wide receiver room there, but is Jackson Arnold the guy that's going to get them the ball? That depends. If he takes a step forward, he's got, he's talented. He's not the most talented quarterback in the conference, but he does have, enough, I think, to make them a, real tough team to play, make them a threat if, he takes a step forward. Hugh Freeze, this could be the year that, he gets placed on the hot seat if we don't see some elevation out of that team there. Lastly, for tier 3, I've got Arkansas. Future of the program under Pittman, it's in question in my mind. It seems like in Arkansas, it seems kind of like football's taking a back seat to basketball there, maybe even baseball. Baseball's doing really well, but they're throwing a lot of money at the basketball program there, and it almost feels kind of like they've just accepted, 6-6, 7-5 there under Pittman for football. So until they move on from Sam Pittman and get more serious there, I don't really have any expectations for Arkansas outside of that, unfortunately, because I think they could be a really good program, kind of like I think that Lane Kiffin, for example, has shown us that in this new world of college football, that even programs that aren't traditional, big time resource programs like Texas or Alabama in this conference, I think that, he's shown that there is a path that you can compete with those teams and even beat them, as Ole Miss did Georgia last year. So until they get more serious there about football, they're not really gonna threaten to elevate. Tier 4, got Mississippi State. It's kind of tough to watch what they've become, since the passing of Mike Leach. They're just a shell of their former self. It's been hard to get talent, and when they do, it's been tough for them to retain it. So, they're finally going to build an indoor practice facility there. So that was just recently announced, but Mississippi State, that kind of speaks for itself right now. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Tier 4. So Vanderbilt, they still need to prove it year over year. They had a great season last year, relatively speaking. But until you have some year over year, production from like what you had last season, you're still going to be considered Tier 4 of the SEC. Kentucky, Fire Stoops. That's pretty much where I'm at here. Like I said about Arkansas, Kentucky is a place that I think if you get the right guy in there, that he could do for Kentucky what Lane Kiffin has done for Ole Miss. But until then, I think that Kentucky's they were threatening, I'd say, a couple of years ago to make an ascension into Tier 2 and be a solid team in the conference. But boy, how the mighty have fallen there at Kentucky. They're sitting at near the bottom of Tier 4 in my mind. So, like I said, they need to get rid of Stoops and move on and get someone who knows and kind of how to operate in this new world and take advantage of that program. The Big Ten. Who is the team to beat? Well, I think that Penn State is the team to beat this year. So, James Franklin, I think that if you're a Penn State fan or if you're just an outside observer and you look at the program and you question James Franklin, I understand. It's, in a sense, it's fair to do so. And if you're a fan, especially a fan who contributes financially, then it's, you have every right to do so. But for outside observers and fans, I would say that you should have faith in James Franklin. I know that they're kind of it's popular to talk about them as being a failure every year because we always build them up in the offseason and then what do? They win 10 games. There's a lot of room to fall. There's a lot more room to fall than there is to rise at Penn State, is what I'm saying. You win 10 games every year, almost every year. So 6 double-digit win seasons for James Franklin and Penn State since he got there in 2014. The only other teams in the conference that have done that are Ohio State and Michigan, and since Oregon's in the conference, it's now Oregon. So that's who you're in the company of at Penn State with James Franklin there. There's, like I said, a lot of room to fall. There's not much, room to grow. There is room to grow. You want to grow, but there's a lot farther to fall if you think it's going to be as simple just if you want to fire him and get someone in there who you think's going to win you a championship. It's not as simple as that. You can't just go pick a name out of a hat and say this is who's going to win a championship. There's a lot of uncertainty around that, and if you have someone who's got you in the picture, the playoff picture, the conference championship picture every year, then I'd ride with that guy. So you won the conference in 2016, obviously lost to Oregon last year for the conference championship, but you did make the playoffs. Worst case scenario for Penn State this year, I'd say 10-2, but you're returning production. You're 33rd overall. You're not number 1 in the conference necessarily, but I think you're keeping enough of the core of that team. You have enough of that core returning. You have some high-level defensive staff additions in Jim Knowles from Ohio State that I think that you can make a serious run this year. And it's not just because Penn State, credit where credit is due, but I also think that Ohio State is going to be down compared to what they were last year. I don't think Michigan's rebuilt, to the level of, that they need to be to compete with you, and you don't even play them in the regular season this year. So I think that it's, the timing is right as far as other teams, I think right now that, like I said, you're at the top of the conference. So let's go through the schedule real quick. You've got Nevada, and I'm going to go through and kind of say, win, loss, toss. You've got Nevada, FIU, and Villanova as your first three games. I think those are all, obviously, you're going to win those games. Then you get a bye. So this is interesting. So you have a bye week, and then you host Oregon. So Oregon's going to be coming off, I think, 4 straight games, and they have to fly from Oregon to Pennsylvania. So they've got, this is, I think, their 5th game in a row. They're flying across the country, and it'll probably be a noon kick, which means that it's going to be real early in the morning for them, for those Oregon Ducks. So that's going to be a toss-up in my mind, but I do heavily favor Penn State in that game. After Oregon, you go to UCLA. That should be a win. You play Northwestern at home. That should be a win. You go to Iowa, which, could be a challenge, but I think you should win that game. Then you get a bye week before you go to Ohio State. Ohio State also has a bye week before they host you, so you're both coming off a bye. I'd put that as a toss. It's there's not very many teams that you could look at, scheduling Ohio State and chalk it up as a win. So that's going to be a toss, but that's more than most, what most teams could say if you're doing this. So after that, you've got Indiana at home, then you go to Michigan State, you get Nebraska at home, you finish the year on the road at Rutgers. I think all those games are, going to be a win. So the ceiling for the regular season, I got you 12-0, the floor 10-2. Even if you go 10-2, depending on what Ohio State and Oregon do, you could still find yourself in the Big Ten championship, kind of, like you did last year, backing your way in. But like I said, highly optimistic about Penn State's odds against Oregon. Ohio State, I got that as just a coin flip. I mean, it's, you're on the road there, so they do have that in their favor, they, being Ohio State, but I think that you're going to be a better team than they are this year, and you took their defensive coordinator, as I said already. So James Franklin, like I said, a long way to fall, not much higher to go. I would keep my faith in him. I have high expectations, like I said. Other teams in the conference are kind of down compared to what they have been last year and the last couple of years. I think you're at the peak of your window. Drew Aller coming back again, I think he was a part of the 2022 class, so, this is his 3rd season in a row playing there, so I think that you're going to be 3rd or 4th? 3rd. I think you're going to be set up to make a run, like I said. I would fully expect you to make the playoffs, and I think even if you don't play for a conference title, that you could find yourself in the playoffs, kind of like Ohio State did last year, where you go 10-2, but you find yourself in the playoffs and you get hot and you go on a run and you just dominate the playoffs and win a national championship. I think that, was fully, in the realm of possibility for Penn State, if not just outright going undefeated. So if their over-under win total wasn't so high, I might put some money on it, but I think Penn State, they're the team to beat in the Big Ten this year. So this kind of transitions us to the final segment, teams I'm high on. So Big Ten, it's Penn State for all the reasons I just mentioned. I won't go over them again, so I'll just leave that there. So teams I'm high on, the Big 12, I got Texas Tech. You're the team I'm highest on the Big 12. Outside of Arizona State, I'm high on them, but I think Texas Tech, kind of coming from, building up and coming from what you were last year, I think that Texas Tech is the team I'm highest on. Now that the spring window is closed, you've got the number 2 transfer portal class in the country, number 1 in the conference, and you are returning Micah Hudson. He is transferring back from A&M after his 2-week trip to College Station. I think that Texas Tech will improve on both sides of the ball, especially the defense with the transfers they're bringing in. They're going all in on football this year. Every year we're kind of seeing this now where athletic departments, the boosters, these teams kind of recognize the situation they're in. Ole Miss was one last year, and they go all in that, that offseason's portal class. They throw a bunch of money around an NIL. They get as, many players as they can, depth pieces and starting talent. I think that Texas Tech has done that this offseason with the, high level transfers they're bringing in, and in the Big 12 where it's a highly competitive conference. I think that they're going to find themselves in the conference championship, probably with Arizona State. And I'm really high on Texas Tech this year, and I'm really excited to watch them. Moving over to the SEC, I mentioned it earlier, kind of hinted at it. Alabama, that's the team I'm highest on in the SEC. I know it's probably not a popular thing to say, and it may even sound silly. Probably unpopular with half of you, sounds silly to the other half, in saying that I'm high on Alabama and kind of see them as an underdog in a sense. But, I think everyone kind of expected in one sense, and if you didn't truly expect it, you were at least had wishful thinking that after the departure of Nick Saban that Bama would fall, and be, kind of like what, say, A&M is. Maybe they go 8-4, 10-2 is the best year, but they really have to work and, scrape and scratch and fight and claw their way to a conference championship. But I think that with the talent that they've brought in with this recruiting class and the talent that, was left over from Saban, I think that, moving on from Jalen Milroe, all due respect, I think that Kalen DeBoer, who is a proven winner with a year 1 to 2 jump in that talent roster, I think that Alabama is primed for a serious run this season. And the good news is you have Vandy at home. So, since that was such a tough road game for you last year, but in all seriousness, I think Alabama is probably the team to beat in the SEC. I think that they're going to be better than Georgia. It's hard. I'm a little iffy on Texas in a sense. Iffy is in, I think 9-3 is in the picture for them. 10-2 is in the picture for them. I think their ceiling's probably 10-2. So I think Bama's ceiling is 12-0. So it's the team I'm highest on in that conference. So wrapping up this show, the ACC, I'm highest on Clemson. I think they're kind of at the peak of their window, similar to some other teams that I've talked about. The rest of the conference, the traditional powers in the conference are down. They don't play Miami. What is Florida State? There's just a lot of questions in the ACC. Right now, the point spread for the LSU game is out. It's Clemson is favored -2.5. So like I said, what is FSU? I don't know. You don't play Miami. I'm a little worried about Georgia Tech and Louisville. I think those are probably your toughest games, depending on how Florida State turns out. So unless you find Miami in the conference title game, you're not gonna play them. I'm not super high on SMU. I don't think they're just gonna be a perennial contender in the ACC. But a lot of havoc this offseason at North Carolina, and like I said, your traditional powers there in the ACC aren't really, a power this year, it seems. So I think Clemson, again, it's easy to say that that's the team to beat in that conference, but I think it is. So, but yeah, that'll do it for this week of the College Football Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you leave a 5-star review, subscribe on YouTube, follow me at Campus Pigskin on X and Instagram. And like I said, make sure you follow the podcast, turn on notifications. But that'll do it for this week's episode. I appreciate you listening. Have a good one.